Okay, so yeah, welcome to the meeting. Happy New Year, everyone. I hope we'll be productive this year as usual. So yeah, it's all timers here, so I don't think that there's much need to say about rules and regulations about recording. So I guess we can move on. And yeah, as this is the birds of a feather kind of meeting, anybody have any topics for today? So I guess we missed the opportunity to present at the KubeCon EU. It's a shame, but yeah, it was a last minute deal, and we didn't figure out the traveling arrangements. Anybody will be there? Kate, you won't, right?
Yeah, I think what is interesting out of the preparations for KubeCon is we were discussing giving a talk about WebAssembly on the edge as a working group topic, but I think that's something as a working group we have started to touch the surface of. And so I think it may have been a good indicator that maybe by next KubeCon we want to feel like we have done a survey of that space, and maybe some analysis, maybe some collaboration with the CNCF WebAssembly working group. Like maybe we can do some joint meetings, some knowledge shares there. Um, I talked to one of the co-chairs, David Justice, of that working group, and they ran out of time submitting it, but the idea was hopefully to co-submit, and that just fell short. But I think that would be a good goal of co-submitting potentially with them for the next KubeCon. And so maybe as an action item, I can reach out to them to see if they would be interested in coming to one of our working group meetings or doing a joint meeting to kind of focus in on what is the intersection of WebAssembly and the edge, and how do we as a working group want to explore that potentially.
Oh, that sounds great.
I think that sounds great. With the theme of like 2024, do we have like an idea of ongoing projects that we've been discussing and are still going? And do we want to sort of set any New Year's resolutions for the working group?
I really like that idea. That can be the theme of this meeting potentially. Maybe we can just kind of, I think my quick answer to that would be um, I don't think we do, but one goal that we've talked about is having more speakers this year. As one general goal is like getting it back to being more of an avenue for learning about projects. But maybe we could just kind of spitball what people would like to get out of the working group this year as well, or project ideas.
Sounds good. We should probably write this down. Is anyone taking notes? I can volunteer if no one is.
I've started doing them, but if you want to hop on it, you can. I was just adding one line.
Sure. How about if we both do it? I'll send you my notes afterwards so we don't miss anything.
Sounds good.
So I really like the Edge Native white paper that the working group put together like last year. I would love to see us build on that, maybe by either elaborating on it or providing proof of concepts or reference architectures for that sort of thing. So I'd toss that into the mix.
And just to clarify, are you also, Rob, have you read the second instance of the paper? So the one that Andy and Joel worked on application behaviors?
I'm not sure.
And so I think that is going to be one of the things we'll be able to kick off this year is the CNCF is about to publish that one. And so we'll be able to um, to disseminate that one. But reference architectures is something we've brought up a lot, so that's definitely one to put down.
Is it the markdown link that I just put in the chat? That looks like it's first edition, actually.
Yeah, that's its existence in the inside the source, correct? Yeah. I don't know if there's a newer it should be. I haven't seen the actual published version yet. I've gotten a copy as recently as probably about a month ago, but nothing newer has come across.
Rob, have you seen, are you in the Slack by any chance?
I am, but I don't get a chance to read it as often.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to know if you're in there because if you go to it and scroll up like 3 scrolls, I guess, the fourth to last post by Brandon Wick is the like finalized version that's being published.
Cool, I'll check that out now.
Hey, Kate and everyone, did we want to take that PDF and put that in the GitHub? Upload it.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning that. I think we can do that. I think if it's also going to be published by the CNCF, so it might make sense just to add a link in the GitHub once it's published. But if we want something there immediately, I think it's fine to upload. I don't know if the CNCF doesn't like you to upload. I think we need to check with Brandon because I wouldn't be surprised if the marketing team wants their release version to be the only release version.
Cool. Wait is a great. I'm good with that. Can wait till that comes out. It was just a question, just a thought.
So just in the interest of adding to the list, I'm also really interested in creating up some sort of description of what a leaf worker node might look like. And so there was some discussion within the group about 6 months ago about this, but the whole idea would be like a worker node that may not have the ability to do everything that a normal worker node could do.
Just to clarify, so basically defining what it means to have a more constrained device and like what the characteristics are of these leaf devices.
Yeah, exactly. So as an example, the Leaf device might not be able to dynamically orchestrate things. Any sort of change in the deployment might trigger a reboot on the device. And so it might have different properties than a normal worker node. So the onus would be on me to put something out for feedback and gather other people's opinions, but I just wanted to put that out there.
And would the goal of that be to define what kinds of applications can be scheduled to those devices, to define what actual machinery is categorized as a Leaf device, like make an inventory of actual machines out there that classify as this? What do you see as, or what do you see as the output kind of that kind of investigation?
Well, the goal is that in a lot of situations, you're not allowed to dynamically change the workloads that are running, particularly for like safety critical systems, because any sort of change in behavior could result in delays in any sort of deadlines. So if you want to do an update to these constrained devices, you actually would need to go and like schedule them for maintenance and reboot them and then load new software on. But then there's certain things that might be in the current description of a normal worker node that this constrained device just wouldn't be able to do anymore. So the idea would be to figure out what exactly would be the minimum set of functionality that these small little devices could do.
On that last part, were you saying how can we take a constrained device a level up? Like, so that's not just firmware updates, but it can do a little bit more?
That could be part of it too, yeah. So things like if a constrained device can no longer provide the heartbeat message to let it know that it's still there, should it be considered offline, or is it just not available at that moment in time? And should you reduce some of the expectations for whether or not the thing is dead on arrival, or whether it's just working in a disconnected mode?
Yeah, I mean, I personally find that topic very interesting. And it's one that we think about with Aukrey a fair bit, of especially the heartbeat one, of how do we define a device as online? How do you not overload the constrained device with heartbeats as well? And how do you discover that device and manage updates? I think it also potentially ties into the Wasm story. And with regards to one thing that I've talked to Shan, who's come a few times to meetings about, is could we put a WebAssembly runtime on a constrained device and do over-the-air updates, sending Wasm modules over the air and updating that way, instead of having to do firmware updates. And that could be an interesting POC to work together through as a group. I don't know, Dehan, if you work with Drogue.io within Red Hat, but
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
that kind of aligns with some of the work that you do with that. I don't know how much involved in WebAssembly y'all are, but I feel like it was a REST runtime for the devices, and so that could maybe be transferable.
Yeah, but unfortunately we're a little bit discontinued Drogue.io, so that's unfortunate. But yeah, it was the Rust async runtime for embedded devices, but it had nothing to do with orchestration and things like that. It was really low level and only supported firmware updates over the air. So yeah.
It did support that or did not?
It did, but it was completely, so to say, out of the. It was typical firmware update kind of things. So it was nothing to do with more integrated solution with the rest of the cloud system, so to say, right? Or edge of any kind. It was typical in embedded use case at the moment. I can find the link and maybe share it so people can find it useful. Give me just a minute.
I think what I liked about the project, I didn't get to be hands-on with it, but that it seemed to make the idea of firmware management more accessible. Like you can make your own drivers in Rust, and because it's just the firmware of constrained devices is like a very stagnant thing. And so to be able to make it more dynamic and have smaller changes more frequently would be very cool. So I'm trying to piece these things together because it seems like there might be an overlap of interest if we wanted to go with a project this year of any sorts.
So here's a component that actually did a firmware update. But as I said, like yeah, it's not currently active maintained, but if you can find it a good home and there's an interest, it could be very interesting to revive the effort, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and with a project like this, it'd be interesting to kind of define the things you were talking about, Rob, of like how, say we are trying to create a story for a runtime on constrained devices with easy over-the-air updates, and expected heartbeat frequencies, we could define what are the characteristics of a device like that and what capabilities do we expect it to have and to offer. So we could kind of almost write a paper first and then create our own story for that next, potentially.
That sounds great to me. It strikes me that there's a lot of different takes on Kubernetes that are trying to connect in like MQTT and other things. I'm thinking of like Cube Edge and Supernode and all of the others. Perhaps we want to try to revisit some of those things. I know we've had people talk about those projects, but it's always good to find out what they're up to, and maybe we want to have some sort of like bake-off or interoperability testing just to see where things are at.
So when you say MQTT in terms of Kubernetes, what exactly do you mean? So is it a data plane or the control plane?
So I haven't
Uh,
tried running KubeEdge myself, but my understanding is that they have a separate agent that talks to the Kubernetes API server, and then it manages the pods, I think, through containerd rather than through like a kubelet. And then it also talks to an MQTT broker to talk to some of the constrained devices. And it sends
Yeah.
events from those constrained devices in through its agent back to the API server, from what I understand.
Yeah, I think it has been a while since KubeEdge folks presented it, and I guess there's a lot of things, they implemented in between. So it might be good to reach out and see what are they up to lately.
The other trend I've observed is there's a lot of projects that are trying to use the existing Kubernetes API code in different ways. And there's stuff like KubeStellar. I see Andy's on the call, that's using it for like control plane to control plane communication. And then there's other folks like the Portainer folks came on a working group call a few weeks back, and they talked about using Kubernetes to Docker. I wonder if there's something in there that we might want to keep track of. As an example, I'm particularly interested in how to extend the work that was pioneered by Rancher Labs with K3S and see whether we can create different flavors or profiles of the kubelet and selectively remove certain functionality if you don't want it, particularly on constrained devices.
Yeah, flexible control plane configurations are one of those subjects that I think will be gaining traction this year and into next. And so, yeah, I think that has a lot to do with managing to constraints, like you just mentioned, for small footprint devices, such that you might find at the edge, but also for built for purpose control planes that don't require all the bells and whistles of a larger control plane. Yeah. So yeah, it does touch, I think, in the area of, if I'm thinking about the charter of this specific group, it does very much touch on that charter of fitting a control plane in the constraints that are available for an IoT edge device.
And I think this is another topic where we have some experts on. So I think this would be another big one to take forward. If we looked into control plane configuration, would we want to do a survey of the space and a survey of the problems and the ways that these control plane configuration solutions are resolving those problems? Or would we want to kind of do a project result around that, whether it be within an existing project like KubeStellar or K3S or something entirely different?
just posted some papers. My understanding that's those are the foundations where the new WebAssembly component model is based on. I just wonder, just the way the componentized design is that when it comes to edge and as well as security in general, does that change how it's managed compared with the traditional containers?
Just to make sure I understand the question, are you asking how does the advent of the component model within WebAssembly change the way we see WebAssembly at the edge, or change the way we compare WebAssembly to containers?
Both, actually.
Okay. So with regards to how it changes the way we see WebAssembly with regards to containers, I think a lot of the same, like a lot of the ways that people are comparing them previously, which is not necessarily there might not even need to be a comparison, but the startup times of WebAssembly being faster, the component model does not change that. The size being smaller and them being equally cross-platform, et cetera, all persist. The thing that changes with the component model is that basically you have these interfaces that define what a component can do and how it can link to other components. And so basically with the component model, instead of having one WebAssembly module, now you can have a bunch of components that are all composed into one .wasm file. And the software development cycle of each one of those components can be separate. And so in that way, you can have completely composable software. And not only is the software development cycle separate, but so is the linear memory space. So security wise, they're also separate. So one example of that is, say you have an application that has some sort of middleware that it does authentication. That middleware is completely isolated in memory from the rest of your business logic. And in that way, someone's request won't even reach your business logic if it does not pass authentication. So there's just, I mean, it's a really big topic. But I guess to answer your question, I don't think if people choose to compare containers to WebAssembly, I think the way this changes the story is this moves people into a new way of developing software that is even more composable and modular, I guess, and more secure is what the component model does. If you're going to compare it to the edge, previous WebAssembly on the edge and components on the edge, I think the story there isn't very different. It's just, once again, you have that better, newer software development experience and security, composability, and potentially you could have the opportunity down the line to send a component that you would compose on the actual device with another larger component. So you could send smaller updates potentially, if we're going to get into that story. I could see that being another benefit of it. I can try and prepare something for us about this specifically if we want to talk more in depth. There's a lot with the component model. I'll also share the Bytecode Alliance's documentation on the component model, which is
so
where
maybe I
Go ahead.
understand correctly. So you're saying, what you're saying basically is WebAssembly componentized model is all within the WebAssembly module itself. So basically, to the outside world, if we use Kubernetes as an orchestrator to manage WebAssembly or maybe other tool to manage WebAssembly, there's no difference because that componentization is all happening between the different modules within the WebAssembly stack itself, right?
Yes. So modules are actually within components if we're going to be really nitpicky. So a component is just a wrapper around a WebAssembly module that can connect with other components to make one larger component. But once you've finished all of this wrapping and linking, the result is one .wasm file. So that same .wasm file you had previously, like it's still just a bytecode format. And yes, you can use the existing Kubernetes schedulers to run WebAssembly components today. So for example, if you've used the containerd shim for WebAssembly, that still works with components. It's the later versions of it support now WASI Preview 2, which supports components, and I can link that. So there are existing Kubernetes runtimes for WebAssembly that have a similar experience that you're used to with containers. Have you used the Containerd shim, Victor?
No, I'm actually just learning. Overall, actually, I'm just learning a lot of basics actually. Other than manageability, security is the same way, right? I don't have to consider like authenticating the individual component. It's more of the end result, the already imported instance of a WebAssembly instance that include all the components that authenticate the same way as the older WebAssembly instance, right?
So people are working on, I think there is specifications underway on how to sign components. I think that work is still underway, but there was no story around that for WebAssembly modules either. But the story about the virtual machine isolation of a component is comparable to WebAssembly modules, just one level deeper in that subcomponents of a component are also isolated. I don't know if that answered your question.
So maybe it come back to the current technology. So with Kubernetes, there is already well-established authentication authorization stack, right? APIs. So with WebAssembly, if we're not using the image as a part of a container image, what is the authentication authorization mechanism used right now for the current stack?
Are you talking about the API layer for requests?
Yeah. For example, can you do you use external authorizers for like if you use can you authenticate using external like a central authentications you know what I have you know what I'll probably need to bring it offline. I have some other details I need to put my thoughts together.
You can I'll send you docs on maybe I think the best way would just be to try it out in Kubernetes. And I might be able to set up a demo for that, but right now potentially, but you would have the same sort of like with your normal Kubernetes setups, you can set up load balancer services. You can set up namespacing and limit like the normal RBAC you have within Kubernetes, you have with WebAssembly as the unit instead of containers. It's completely identical how you manage request authentication on top of WebAssembly as you do with containers.
Yeah, actually, I know there's a simpler question. Does WebAssembly support attribute-based authentication? I mean, authorization.
I'm not sure I understand. So WebAssembly is just it's just a bytecode format. So whatever's executing it would have to do that sort of authentication, from my understanding, unless I'm misinterpreting your question. But the WebAssembly runtime itself, whatever triggers it to run, in this case, the Containerd shim, would need to handle, and on top of that, the Kubernetes API would need to handle that authentication.
Okay, thanks. I probably actually follow up, but I'll take it offline. Thanks.
I think like a general discussion of the different roles and benefits of things like the WebAssembly modules versus containers or with containers, and then comparing and contrasting it to other things that are emerging, like you've got OS tree and then systemd sysx, and then you've got OS tree being delivered via like an OCI container registry. Some of that would make interesting topics to discuss. Some of the things that I've heard have been things like, from a security perspective, when you start delivering things as individual files, it becomes very hard to do integrity measurement within the container because you have to go and check each file individually. So then people have stated that block level distribution formats like systemd, sysx might make it easier to do security in those sorts of scenarios. So there's some interesting trade-offs, I think, between those when you start to consider using different formats for managing your workloads.
Yeah, and I think in that discussion, we would need to try and keep it, we would need to layer up as we discuss it. So literally start with just a container, just WebAssembly and running it locally using Docker or Wasm time, and then layer up the discussion to what sort of controls do you have with the given orchestrator for that kind of unit.
Mhm.
Another one is unikernels and micro VMs and hypervisors are also kind of entering the space of like minified VM applications. And some of those have WebAssembly embedded in them already instead of just using Wasm, but it would be interesting to look at each of those units.
So I saw from CES, the SDV Alliance, Software Defined Vehicle Alliance, was just announced. And I don't know if you folks are looking into that space, but they're talking a lot about how to do the management of different workloads, particularly safety critical and non-safety critical workloads side by side on the same IoT device at the edge. So if there's any interest in that sort of stuff, then that's something we could pursue as well. We could get people from Sophie or Eclipse SDV or Covisa to come and talk a little bit about those topics.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I think generally the SDV topic is getting big. So and it's definitely IoT Edge related. So it'd be good to get more info and the context of those.
Here's a picture for anyone unfamiliar with it. If I could paste it. It seems like we've got a really good list of things so far. Are there any other burning topics that people are interested in talking about in 2024?
I just feel like this Edge compared with other part of the Open Linux Foundation ecosystem, Edge is where it's most confusing. Even still, even with the white paper, that's a great foundation. Ideally, there'll be more clarification in the form of blog or white paper, on just different type of things, and like Robert said, like constrained, right? When it's constrained, whatever was done in the data center no longer can no longer do. But what type of edge, like what technology are there? And when we take on, I mean, WebAssembly definitely is taking off for sure, but where are we when it comes to that? And yeah, I just like the discussion Caden had about WebAssembly. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to just write it down instead of just talking about it.
So given that this working group is now under the CNCF, would we still want to define the edge, or would we leave that up to LF Edge to publish that sort of stuff?
I believe RFEdge is not focusing on this particular. I know they focus more on like the in general more like a bigger industry wide perspective, but it doesn't from a technology perspective. What is specifically, especially container versus assembly, WebAssembly, and all those details. I don't believe that's in the scope for RFEdge.
Any other topic ideas? Or
One
areas
of the
of
things that
focus?
was mentioned at the outset of the call is that we may have missed the deadline for KubeCon EU. I'm wondering if we want to come up with a list of potential conferences where we would want to be involved just so we could get ahead of the ball.
I'm confused. I thought there was some communication at the end of last year that says our deadline for submission as part of this group is later than that of the call for proposals. Is that not the case now?
No, it was later. I think
Okay.
the choice was to not submit.
Okay.
And that was on me, in part because our goal was to submit something about WebAssembly on the edge. And I reached out to the WebAssembly Kubernetes working group, and they said they wanted to collaborate and then didn't follow up in time. And given that none of the maintainers of the working group were going to be able to make it there to the conference, it was a confusing situation of who I was hoping the WebAssembly working group would submit the talk, but they didn't end up submitting anything either. So it didn't make sense
Okay.
I didn't feel like we were ready to talk about that as a working group, since we haven't dedicated a ton of time to it yet.
Right.
And so I wanted to piggyback off the Wasm working group for it, but it did make clear that that is something we might want to become established in. Hence potentially focusing on WebAssembly on the edge a little bit more this year, to be a voice of expertise in that as a working group.
Okay.
Is there anything we could do to help support you in those endeavors, Kate?
I think we should try to work on certain things. I think the idea of coming up with a project within the working group with regards to WebAssembly on the edge, and talking about that would be interesting. I'm also happy to facilitate discussions around that more in the working group, and maybe that's what we need. But I think as a working group, we should come up with some sort of, either we can survey what exists or we can produce something, but I don't feel like we've taken action on either of those, beyond kind of dipping our toes into the space. Is there one of those that would be more interesting to y'all, like to learn more about WebAssembly on the edge, to do projects with WebAssembly on the edge, to discuss or write a paper about some of the ways that it could apply? Like, what is the method with which we want to be involved in that space?
I haven't done anything with WebAssembly much myself, but my thought is perhaps we want to look at when various WebAssembly conferences are, because we might be able to present at those as well as KubeCon, and that might give us an opportunity to sort of set some earlier milestones, so to sort of build up the project as we go through the year.
I guess my question is, what are we presenting?
I would assume that a lot of the people involved with WebAssembly are used to running it locally, but probably haven't tried to deploy it to edge devices, particularly with technologies like Kubernetes. So I would suggest some sort of mashup between those two.
Cool. Yeah, I like that. So basically we can be basically we can take what projects exist there and show how you can put it on your edge devices or in your edge architectures and kind of facilitate that knowledge spread.
Yeah.
Awesome. I've been trying to get a stack of Raspberry Pis for like months. So once that comes in, I would love to start playing around with that and kind of sharing that exploration and maybe in tandem with folks too.
Yeah, in the last Wasm meeting, I had to join the last, well, not last one, the one last year, in the last year. Lead actually mentioned that WebAssembly, a paper idea called one Wasm. Basically, one Wasm is a good fit versus one is still not there yet. Maybe for this group, it actually also applies. Will be one Wasm on the edge. Basically, one WebAssembly is a good fit in one situation, and one is still developing, and how does it work with containers? The good thing I find in the open source community is once you write something down and show some expert, most likely he will also come and pitch in. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think something that people are kind of looking for is that like dichotomous key of does WASM work for me? I think with these kind of questions that are more broadly WASM, I think we should figure out whether we're imposing on the WebAssembly working group within the CNCF. And I think that maybe starts with maybe having a more direct relationship with them and trying to figure out should that kind of discussion live within us or within them. But I mean, certainly we can start having those discussions around WinWasm, and that might be something that we prepare to them and get their feedback on and build up on. But that's something I've been having in the back of my mind is just trying to make sure we're in line with them, or whether as a working group, how we can coordinate more with them on this topic. So I guess going through all these topics, I just want to recap everything we said we could work on this year, since it's a bit bold and ambitious. We said doing more presentations, and we have a list of 3 potential ones. That being having the Wasm working group come, CubeEdge, and SDV, having maybe one of them present. More maybe doing a reference architecture for some of the white paper design behaviors we discussed. Focusing on leaf devices and potentially focusing on the firmware update story there and doing some POCs, maybe bringing Wasm into that picture. Revisiting Kubernetes on the edge projects, so kind of surveying the space there and doing some comparison. Talking about control plane configuration or the use of Kubernetes APIs in more nuanced ways. And defining Edge more fully as a working group. Spreading information about conferences to be involved in. And then in general, kind of sinking into WebAssembly on the edge and showing how you can use Wasm on the edge today. It seems like the last one is the one that kept coming back up in the conversation. And maybe that's where we want to start, but I don't want to put weight on that just because that's what we've been talking about. Should we focus on multiple of these? Like, where do we want to take this list? Do we want to prioritize? Are there things we can do in tandem? Are some of these just one meeting kind of deep dives?
Compared with last year when there's no topic in a lot of meetings, I think any topic is fine for the meetings.
I like the idea of working on the last one, but I'd want to make sure that we kept things open for things that are more related to like the infrastructure, because I think that has a lot of pull from people that may be watching from the outside and not actively participating in the working group here. So I just want to make sure to continue to talk about things like Stellar and Edge and the other technologies that sort of power things behind the scenes.
So so it sounds like maybe we start with discussing, maybe next meeting we just kind of do a hands-on with WebAssembly. Like we all use it a little and run it, and like I'm happy to lead a hands-on with it, and maybe we can show how to deploy it to Kubernetes and kind of go through that demo the next meeting. And also in that meeting, I can have like a prepared list of where people are using WebAssembly, what runtimes exist, what projects are unfolding, and like what is the resource deck. And then based on how that goes, we can decide where we want to go next. Maybe from there we feel like, okay, let's start doing this specific experimentation with it, with edge devices, or maybe people go off on their own and start experimenting and come back with some findings.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, that sounds great to me. And would the focus be on like WebAssembly as a runtime in a language and how to make your first hello world, or would you include a part of like how to set up Wasm Edge? What would be the goal for the first one?
So I guess to get the most like happy path, I would want to start with like the local developer experiencing of just running WebAssembly locally, then go to Kubernetes. And because I would preference my company's open source tool because that's what I'm most familiar with, but I'm happy to also show some of the other tools out there and just native WebAssembly I'll demo as well. If we want to do that, but I'd probably focus on Spin, which is within the CNCF Wasm landscape, and that's the one that my company focuses on. And then deploying Spin apps to Kubernetes, which you can do with like a K3D cluster locally, and see that flow. And then we can take that same .wasm file and run it locally with Wasm time, which is basically the reference implementation for the Bytecode Alliance, which is the open source organization that basically is managing and developing the specifications for the WebAssembly component model. So when you hear the words preview 1, preview 2, which Rust is now coming out with the preview 2 version for natively compiling components, that's all run by the Bytecode Alliance. So we could do that. Do you feel like that story works as an arc? And then maybe we could also see if Liam wants to talk about Wasm Edge, which is the runtime that he develops, and that also uses Wasm time under the hood. So both Spin and Wasm Cloud use Wasm time as the underlying WebAssembly runtime. So we could kind of show a story there.
I think that sounds great. And the other thing that I realized is that I don't have a magic decoder ring to know what the different projects are. So maybe that would be useful as well.
Okay.
Because I didn't know that there were different alternatives or different projects out there. So it'd just be good to know what I don't know. Personally, the one I'm most familiar with is the Whammer from the Bytecode Alliance, but I couldn't tell you why you would choose one over another.
Yeah. Wasm time is so Whammer is supposed to be a minified version of Wasm time that's specific to smaller, more constrained devices, which makes sense that you've used it, Rob. Recently, there was optimizations that Alex Crichton made to Wasm time to get it to be particularly small, to the point where you get almost those same benefits with Wasm time. So because that Wasm time is the runtime with both Spin and Wasm Cloud, I'll probably start with Wasm time, but we can also look at Whammer, and it does have support for components and all of that too. So that's another one we can look at.
That sounds great.
That's a lot for one meeting. So we'll see how far we get. Because I'm assuming we also want to start with just like an intro to WebAssembly as well, which we've done a few times in the working group, but kind of just flowing through it.
And if it makes it easier for you, Kate, my suggestion would be if we load you up with too much at one point, we're probably going to get oversaturated with all of this new knowledge. So if you wanted to split it up over multiple meetings, that would probably make it easier for you, and we might have more time to play with it in between.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Perfect. Yeah. And I think part of me was wondering, like, these are information shares that are good in general, not specific necessarily to the edge space, but I think it'll be helpful if, as we're doing this, like questions specific to edge projects we're working on can come up and we can kind of pause and look into it. And because I've been really focused on WebAssembly in the cloud, I probably won't have the answers to what exists and how people are using it necessarily, but we can all explore that together.
That sounds awesome.
And then for some of the other topics, if like, for example, when Wasm that you gave, Victor, we can kind of maybe compile that as we go. And the other topics of like comparing different control plane configurations, those seem to be topics we can circle back to for like a few week intervals and potentially come out with like kind of summaries that we maybe post or talk about. Same with like maybe defining leaf devices and surveying Kubernetes Edge projects. So this is a really cool list, and Rob, really appreciate you pushing for us to come up with it, because we clearly had a lot that we were excited about.
Actually, I think Rob earlier mentioned that like just doing multiple, it might be good to. I think Rob, you work on real-time operating system, right? That's your company do. Is that right?
That's one of the things for sure. Yep.
Okay, so it might be good actually. I'm not a hands-on developer per se. I'm a database guy, but it'd be interesting while doing the hands-on. It probably a question may come up on this particular feature when we're implementing it. Is it a fit for Edge? So might be just like Rob said, I'm doing multiple things at the same time, doing hands-on and at the same time analyze it whether it's a fit for Edge might be a good just doing multiple things at the same time.
That's a really good point, and it might be helpful to have that list of what a fit is beforehand, or try and come up with those ideas. Like, does it run on RTOS, for example? Would be a good question to have.
Yeah, and I think in those discussions we probably need to every time elaborate what we mean by cloud or edge in the context of the discussion, because I've even caught myself saying cloud when I really mean an on-prem cluster of computers running Kubernetes, which is not the same cloud as someone that might be thinking of one of the cloud service providers that's running off in a data center somewhere else. Cool. Well, I'll send my notes to you, Kate, after the meeting, just just in case there's anything extra I captured that you missed. But we managed to fill the hour, so we did a good job.
Yeah, and Rob, if it might be actually easier because I took my notes directly in the doc, would you be willing to integrate yours with them there and just fill the gaps that I had?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Awesome. Great. Well, I will see you all in a couple weeks.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Take care.